So I guess you can start. Um, who we have here. I mean, the main point of this meeting was to kind of get Mike to flesh out his theory a bit more, and maybe, well, also ask some questions about it as well. So, Mike, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, as I guess I mentioned in the email, I took a read of the book. I mean, as I said, it's probably something I'm gonna have to read a second time to really integrate the material properly.
Okay.
But yeah. So I noticed you. Well, I mean, the whole thing stems from um this, I guess, research of Piaget. Could you maybe tell us more about who Piaget was and what exactly was he researching, and how did your or why did you, I guess, get inspiration from Piaget for your
Okay.
mind?
I can start there, and then maybe I can share the screen as well, right? Is that okay?
Yeah, yeah. Let
All right.
me give you permission. All right, you should be able to share the screen.
Okay, let's see. Record, chat, stop video, share screen. Okay. All right. So I'll start here. Control L. Can you see my screen? Hello?
Yeah, yeah, I'm seeing.
Okay.
Yeah, I
Okay.
can see that.
Okay. So, um, I guess the place to start would be at the beginning. Um, I when I was about back in 1985, I was working at Columbia University in their computer science department as a high school student, working doing some accounting uh, for uh, the assistant director of the account of the uh, computer science department's accounting division, and her name was Teresa Smith. I was there on a high school scholarship summer internship program, and I got a chance and got exposed to a lot of the professors that were teaching there um, at Columbia University. They had a lot of uh, splendid teachers, and some of them gave me a little extra time and showed me some of the things that they were working on. And outside, they had some book vendors outside the university. People just selling books. And one day I happened across a book vendor, and I picked up one of the books that he had, and it was called The Development of Thought by Jean Piaget. And so I picked that up, I bought it, and I started to read it, and it was very dense book, very, had a lot of jargon in it that I couldn't understand. And so I put it down, and then I came back to it years later, probably about 4 years later. Started trying to read it again, and then I put it down again, and it came back to it another decade later, and eventually I got through it. Um, and basically, it was Jean Piaget outlining how he thought people worked. And then I read several other of his books, and and essentially, came to an understanding of what his theory of knowledge was. And I incorporated some of that into this book, and we can go through this. I think this would be good to go through. So this book is called Building Minds with Patterns, and I have an introduction, and here we talk about minds, both natural and artificial minds, and how we measure minds. And then we talk about design patterns, that can be used to build minds. And then finally, we outline the Piagetian modeler. So in detail, we go through some theoretical perspectives. We talk about Piaget's theory, and I give reasons why. Then we talk about how we measure a mind using Bailey's infant scales, how we use Piaget's measures, or the CHC model, which focuses on G, general measure of general intelligence. And then we talk about different kinds of artificial minds that exist already. Talk about different types of minds, mind servers. And then I come up with a mind template. And then we talk about existing mind architectures and then some requirements we might want for a mind. And then later I talk about patterns. Oops. Talk about patterns, mind patterns. The different categories of patterns. And then finally, we talk about the Piagetian modeler. So the one thing I think would be interesting to go through. Oops. One thing I think would be interesting to go through is the acknowledgements section. Okay, so this book integrates the research of Jean Piaget, who was a developmental psychologist, and he was also a biologist. The work of Gary Drescher and Frank Guerin, who work on developmental artificial intelligence. The work of Sheldon Linker, who assisted in developing the premise programming language, and also has his own AI chat system, generative chat system. Roland Hauser, who is a good figure in database semantics and natural language processing. Roger Schank, Michael Dyer, Robert Walensky, Richard Mikowski, who are experts in knowledge representation and inference. Pei Wang, who is an expert in reasoning, particularly reasoning with limited resources. Bipin Indurkia, who wrote a really great book called Metaphor and Cognition. And in that book, he talks about sensory motor data sets and concept networks. Marvin Minsky, who wrote The Society of Mind, among other books, and he talks about agents and activation. George Lakoff, who talks about embodiment. He talks about memory, he talks about activation, he talks about metaphor. Mark Pickett and Tim Oates, who talk about concept induction and clustering. Paul Faggard and Paul Rosenblum, who talk about belief propagation. Paul Faggard is from the University of Waterloo. Doug Lennett, who talks about symbolic microtheories, and he and his company developed the Psych program since I think 1984. Joanna Bryson, who's an expert in action selection. Antoine Bechara and Antonio Damasio, who are experts in decision making. Christian Hammond, Manuela Veloso, Jaime Carbonell, who are experts in planning, in automated planning. Eric Mueller, who is an expert in daydreaming and mental simulation. His thesis was the Daydreamer program. Dietrich Dorner and Joscha Bach, who are experts in motivation. Richard Sutton, Andrew Bartow, who are experts in reinforcement learning. Wei-Min Shen, who is an expert in surprise-based learning. Stacy Marcella, Jonathan Gratch, Phoebe Ellsworth, Klaus Scherer, who are experts in appraisal theory, emotion, and coping. And Andreas Demetriou, who is an expert in psychological assessment, and other authors as well. But these are the main authors that this book draws upon. So it draws upon a wide body of expertise in artificial intelligence, cognitive science. So that's the first thing I wanted to say, is that this book builds upon a vast body of literature, and the bibliography shows that as well. So basically, there are a lot of theories out there, and despite its flaws, I chose Piaget's theory. You can see that, there are biological theories, contextualist theories, theory-based knowledge theories, information processing, and neo-Piagetian theories. But I go back to Piaget's theory because it was groundbreaking. If you've watched the video, you've seen this diagram that I created, which kind of outlines Piaget's theory and all the different aspects of it. It's a very encompassing theory, but we can go through a few. We'll come back to this, but and this is a concept network of things dealing with Piaget's theory. It's on page 31 of the book, and yeah, there's a lot going on, but essentially. At the beginning, Piaget believed that we have mental structures, and he believed that we construct these structures in a continuous manner from birth till death. He said that on our cognitive structures, we have what we call affirmations and negations. An affirmation represents the existence of something, and the negation represents the non-existence of something. And these are just two things that he believes exists. So we have an A is an affirmation marker. This shows that something exists, and B is a negation marker. He said that when you see something, anything that you perceive directly, physically, shows you the positive characteristics. And so it shows you the affirmations. The negations you have to infer, and the negations come later. And those negations are perceived after interaction with the objects. So basically, he said that we have, cognitive container structures called schemes. And a scheme basically contains the affirmation or negation. So what we have is like a cell or a scheme, a concept. You can think of it as a concept, but it's actually a pre-concept. And some schemes may show the positive characteristic or the affirmation. Some schemes may show the negation, and some schemes may have both. So these are the basic mental structures that Piaget proposed that we have in our minds, and everything is made out of these structures. Then he goes on to talk about observables, and observables are immediate sensory perceptions that an individual has, and there are two important kinds of observables. Propriocepts, which are our internal sensations of our bodily movements, and exterocepts, which are external sensations of perceived objects. So these out here are exterocepts. It's what we see or perceive outside. And these are interocepts, or internal bodily positions, bodily sensations, anything that you feel inside your body. These are called interocepts. And anything that you perceive in the outside world, whether you hear it, whether you see it, whether you taste it, whether you feel it, they're called exterocepts because they're external. And these are just percepts, something that's perceived. And basically, you have observables and then you have coordinations. A coordination is something that you infer after you've perceived something. Does this make sense so far? Or is anybody lost at this point?
I'm following.
Okay. So basically, Piaget thinks, and it's Piaget's idea that we build up knowledge representations out of these observables and out of these inferences or coordinations. So the exterocepts we perceive and are reflected internally. These are the external items. And then we infer things on top of those. Likewise, the interocepts that we have, our bodily sensations, these are internal. These are represented internally, and then we infer things on top of those. And Piaget said that there are two basic processes happening: assimilation, which means taking in information from the outside world, and accommodation, which means changing the mental structures that exist inside. So this is essentially the gist of what he believes is happening within everyone. We are assimilating information, taking in information from the external world, and then we are changing our internal representations to accommodate it to the realities of what's going on outside. So that's the basic idea: assimilation and accommodation. Does this make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's the basis of everything. Then he just talks about, when you are building up these internal structures, you can have collateral subsystems, which are subsystems on the same hierarchical level. And you can also have hierarchical subsystems, one subsystem built on top of another. And then the word schema refers to this, a subsystem, just a collection of a network of these things grouped together. He talks about actions. And an action is a subsystem that works together to perform a specific complex behavior. And so actions require generally some external perceptions, some internal perceptions, some inferences going on, and then some movement, some coordinated movement. So this is basically just a grouping. And so an action contains schemes. There's conditions under which the action happens, and then things that happen as a result of the action taking place. So let's see. He talks about, go ahead.
Before you continue, yeah, like at the start, you said I think the shaded circles mean, I'm not sure if it's affirmations and the unshaded ones are negations, or is it the other way around?
Yes. So the affirmations and negations. So the shaded circles are affirmations, and the hollow circles are negations. Yes.
Yeah. So I noticed, like, on some of the inference boxes, you have negations. What is that saying really? Is it like a
it means that when something is not exist, that's
okay.
when we use it. So when something is not present, so there are certain conditions that are present, and there's certain other conditions that are not present. So for example, if you're moving your arm from left to right, you can continue the motion if there's nothing blocking you, right? So if there's nothing in your way, if there's nothing obstructing you, then you can continue the motion. But you can't continue the motion if it's blocked. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So wait, that would be an example of negation if it's blocked.
Yeah. So if it's blocked, if you have a contact with something, then you may infer that you cannot proceed. So it's just a kind of inference. So there are positive inferences and there are negative inferences. That's just the idea. The basic idea is that there are things that exist and then things that don't exist. And the things that exist are easily perceived directly, but things that don't exist, you have to infer them over time. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It is not 100% correlating to this diagram that you're watching, because this diagram is just an example. It's not, like there's no, but this is the idea. This is the basic idea. Does that make sense or no?
Yeah, yeah, I get.
Or should we go back a little bit to this concept?
I understand what you're saying in terms of difference between one that exists and one that doesn't.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So let's see. Uh, we can. The question is how deep do we want to get into this or not? But okay, let's just take it as it is. So then, basically, I'll read through this. This is fundamental, and then once we understand this, we can probably move faster. So an action, otherwise also called an action schema, is a subsystem that works together to perform a specific complex behavior. Actions typically marshal an ensemble of primitive fine motor behaviors to execute a complex behavior. An action can occur in one or more modalities. Actions can occur in the visual modality. So for example, moving your eye or what the center of your eye is called the fovea. So moving the fovea, left or right or up or down. It can occur in the phonal modality. Somebody actually needs to put themselves on mute. In the phonal modality, that is basically when you're talking. So you're moving your tongue around and expelling wind. In the tactile modality, where you're touching things, you can move your fingers and change the joint positions to get different sensory impressions. In the kinesthetic modality, where you're moving your arms, moving your limbs, and so on. So you can have different actions occur in different modalities, your different sensory modalities. And actions are physical, and they typically exert forces on objects. You have actions, certain actions are repeatable. So which means that once they're done, the conditions for them to happen again are present. So you can repeat it. Some actions are not repeatable. So a repeatable action is one where the conditions under which the action is triggered continue to exist after the completion of the action, thereby allowing the action to be triggered again. So a repeatable action is also called a circular reaction. And so can anybody think of an can anybody think of an example of a repeatable action? That you can do with your body?
Walking.
Yeah, walking is a repeatable action. You take a step, right? And then you take another step. And then when you finish, you end up in the same position you were originally so that you can continue to take a step and then take a second step. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So as long as your pathway is not blocked and you can continue to step, then that can be a repeatable action. So there are two kinds of ways actions can be repeated. And a repeatable action is called a loop. And either the condition, so here we have the condition of the action for the start and the ending condition are the same in example A, or you have a chain of actions that happen, a chain of inferences that happen, and the end of the chain brings you back to the beginning. So in the case of walking, there's a whole bunch of different movements and motions that you make, but when you finally finish, you end up in the same place you started. Okay. So these are two kinds of actions that are repeatable. You know, this is called a scheme cycle, and this is called a circular scheme. So you have an individual scheme, but when it fires or when it does its job, uh, the conditions are still the same. And here, the conditions may change, but ultimately they come back to the same starting point. So, repeatable actions. So, what happens is Jean Piaget thought that a repeatable action is the key to development. He said that a child performs some action and accidentally discovers something, a new element, similar to previous elements that the child has encountered before. And then the child attempts to reproduce the element in an effort to make the perception last. And then this doing something and repeating it, and then discovering something new in the process is basically the start of development. He said this kind of curiosity is part of the child's motivational architecture, and it's much different from other needs of a child like hunger or thirst. Emotional arousal and desire also play a part in this exploratory behavior. Um, Flavel suggests that the kinds of elements or schemes that arouse the child's curiosity are ones that are only partially assimilated or partially understood, the ones the child does not fully understand, ones that are surprising, novel, complex, or puzzling. The child's ability to discover causes her to formulate hypotheses, conduct experiments, confirm hypotheses, and derive satisfaction. This discovery mechanism appears to be part of the child's in, um, initial architecture, and it helps to reduce the uncertainty and increase predictability in the world. So a child repeats some actions, and in the repetition of these actions comes across novelties in the world. And then it tries to understand these novelties by um, making hypotheses and conducting experiments. So repeated action is one thing Jean Piaget says is very important. And that gets back to this item here. So spontaneous actions occur spontaneously at first, then the child deliberately tries to reproduce some phenomenon in the world that it discovered spontaneously, and then eventually it tries to experimentally uh, recreate this phenomenon in the world. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So
Okay.
you're saying it's kind of like when a child maybe is learning to walk, where they get up, they take a step but they fall down and then they try again and again and again. That's kind of
Yes.
like the experimenting and
Yes.
until they get better at it.
Yes. Or even when a child is sitting in a high chair and you maybe put some peas or some food in front of the child, and the child picks up one of the peas or some of the food and puts it in its mouth and say, "Hey, that tasted good." And maybe it wants to try to do that again for the for the second time in its life. And it might pick up a pea and then try to get in its mouth again, and it might fail, or the mother or the father, whoever's caregiver is, gives them a pea, puts it in their mouth, and then they might try to do it themselves, and so on. So yes, it's basically how a child uh, begins to start learning. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, this sounds very similar to reinforcement learning. I guess it's tied to that, the whole idea of repeating actions. But I guess there's somewhere in your thing. I think you did mention reinforcement learning somewhere deeper down.
Right. So
Is that
yes. So
related to this?
um, the part that's related is the part of is repetition, but reinforcement learning as is implemented in computer programs, essentially involves, uh, pretty fixed structure of, you have well-defined actions and states that lead to the actions called policies. So state action pairs, and then you have an environment which produces states and reward signals, and you have a whole mechanism defined, a whole little architecture defined, um, in order to do reinforcement. Then you have some algorithm that computes the state. We're talking about something much more basic though than that here. This, we're talking about, how people start learning for the first time, and a little bit more, a little bit more general
Okay.
than that. But yes, some of that is involved.
All right.
I suppose the part that's involved, the reinforcing. So there's reinforcement and correction, right? Reinforcement occurs when uh, something happens that's positive, and the child likes that behavior and wants to reproduce it. And correction happens when the child fails at attempting something, and then it tries to change the behavior or prefer a different behavior. Okay, so a skill is just a set of actions. Okay, and Piaget calls the totality uh, uh, all the actions and all the skills and all the inferences that individual has. So all the skills, operations, actions, and other subsystems that an individual has is called a totality. So assimilation is basically forming schemes. So we have observables, and basically the mind creates a scheme to account for these observables. So basically, this observable basically says uh, some internal sensation or interocept B2, and, and some external sensation B double prime exists in the world, and um, some other sensation C happens at a later time, but somewhat connected. So to assimilate means to create synthesize a new scheme, a new inference that says that B2 and B double prime lead to C. So when you assimilate something, you're basically just constructing a new scheme internally in the mind, creating an association that says B2 and B double prime lead to C. Does this make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So when you observe some things, you can make an association in your mind. So this is how it makes the association. Now it's connected. Anytime you see B2 and B double prime, you'll think of C. Assimilation basically is creating an association, right? And this inference basically says B2 and B double prime implies C, or they lead to C. Okay, so when you think of B2 and B double prime, it leads to C. Assimilation is basically just creating these inferences. Accommodation is copying an inference and modifying it. So when you have an inference already that B2 and B double prime lead to C, you can create a new inference, and D also occurs. You can create a new inference that says B2 and B double prime lead to D. Let's zoom in a little bit on this. You can say B2 and B double prime lead to D as well. And then if there's also a B prime sitting around, you can say B2 and B prime lead to C. So accommodation just means you copy an inference that exists, and you tweak it, you modify it, you substitute other elements for what's in it. Does that make sense? Does this make
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah.
So assimilation means to create an association in the first place, and accommodation simply means to clone an existing association and do a substitution in it, to copy and modify. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. Yeah, so we can, so those two things, assimilation and accommodation, are the essence of what Piaget says is going on with us. And you know, when you have an action, basically you modify that action by doing these copies and modifies, right? So for example, if you have an action in you know, a particular skill that allows you to hold a ball, right? This skill gets modified by applying the action to different objects. So for example, you have this ability to grip a ball, a tennis ball, but then if you have a grape, you take that ability and you modify it to the grape. So before you had a tennis ball, but now you have a grape. So you can modify that ability and apply it to a grape. So basically you're copying that skill and you're modifying it to work on a different object. And likewise, you can copy that skill and modify it to work on a balloon, or copy and modify it to work on a basketball. So essentially that skill gets generalized to a variety of different objects. You have an initial skill, or you have an initial action that you can take, and that action gets modified through interaction with the world, interaction with different objects. And that's how a particular action grows. And then if you are presented with a spoon, you'd have a different action altogether. The way you form your hand to hold a ball is different from the way you form your hand to hold a spoon. So now we develop a new skill or a new action called the spoon gripping action. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So, you know, you can think of these as you know, actions on things in the world. And let's see what there's a whole lot that comes in here, but so essentially what happens is you are trying to do things in the world and you fail, and you can fail for a variety of reasons, but when you fail, it generates what's called a contradiction, right? And you have different kinds of contradictions. You have you know, three basic kinds: defective identity, incomplete compensation, unnecessary inference. But basically you have failures for physical or causal means, and you have failures for logical means. So let's see what is useful here. So let's talk about so these were so the way you manage your failures is called regulations, and then the way you recover from failure is called compensation, right? So compensation happens in a couple different ways. So regulation basically means to reinforce or to correct actions that fail, right? Or inferences that fail. That's what regulation is. And compensation means to recover from a failure by either taking an action that reverses the situation or replanning the goal from the current situation, or assessing the situation and deciding to continue, or just deciding to continue or quit for a particular reason. So let's see. Yeah, so there's different kinds of compensations. So I'm skipping over some detail, but let's try to make this coherent. Essentially, when you come to yeah, so there are different things you can do to compensate for failures. One thing you can do is called an alpha compensation, right? And an alpha compensation means basically you enter a situation you that you can't fully classify. It doesn't quite match what you already know, and you have two choices. You can fit it into a category that you already know. So, for example, this new information I was giving you earlier, you have a category in your mind called reinforcement learning. So you're trying to match the new information I gave you into your reinforcement learning bucket or bin, right? Does this make sense? So you have some pre-existing bins, and then you have a garbage bin in your mind. And there are these different ideas that are coming across to you. And in this example right here, you have a circle bin and a square bin. And you have different things coming along on the conveyor belt. You have circles, you have squares, but you also have triangles and ovals. Does this make sense?
Yeah, so far.
Yes. So you have something in your mind that's a sorter. It's called an alpha compensator, right? Or it's a sorter. And this sorter, this alpha compensator, will take these new concepts, these concepts that are rolling across, coming at you, and stick them in the bins that it understands. So right now you have a circle bin and you have a square bin, and the alpha compensator sometimes puts circles in the circle bin, but sometimes it also puts ovals in the circle bin. And then you have a square bin, and sometimes it puts squares in the square bin, but sometimes it also puts I forgot what this figure is called. Trapezoids in the circle, in the bin. And the way it does that is by ignoring certain aspects. It focuses on the fact that this edge is circular, and it ignores the fact that this edge is elongated, right? So it distorts the information that comes in and tries to squeeze it into buckets it understands. It doesn't really take into account all the features. It only looks at some features and makes a determination. And um, and the things that it doesn't understand, it just ignores and throws them in the trash bin. So the ideas that it doesn't really understand, it throws them away. This is called your alpha compensator. And this is how, go ahead.
Yeah, when you said throw it in the trash bin, in terms of the mind, what's actually happening? Are you saying
in terms of the mind that you just ignore it? You just ignore it. It doesn't get stored anywhere in your brain. You just pass over it, right? So you have in this book, there's a lot of new ideas coming across, and some of those ideas are going to stick and get distorted and stored in your bin, like the reinforcement bin. And other ideas you may match as well, but certain other ideas just don't fit into what you already know. And so you're going to throw those away. They're just going to ignore this, right? So that's called alpha compensation. And that's what people do reflexively. The next level up is called beta compensation. Beta compensation basically says you have some ideas that are coming across, you have some existing bins, but it's going to take the time and recognize new features that exist on this item. And it's actually going to create new categories so that you can store things appropriately. So here, whereas before you only had a circle and a square bin, now you have a circle bin, a square bin, a trapezoid bin, and an ellipse bin. So the beta compensator will actually create new categories for you by taking into account features that you previously ignored.
So does this happen in parallel or like sequential? Like the beta and the alpha, like do they?
It's all going
Does
on.
it happen?
It's all happening in your mind in parallel. And
Okay.
as you build new structures, you're able to take in new structures. And then you're going to be doing alpha compensation on this four, as well as beta compensation on these four, and so on. And you're going to continue to create more and new concepts, right? That's basically what Piaget said is happening in terms of your understanding of things. And then eventually, you'll get to the point where you can transform one thing into another thing. And these are called gamma compensations, where you're able to take one thing and transform it into a different category at will, right?
What's the use of that?
What's the use of that?
Yeah.
Have you ever done any math equations?
Yeah.
In mathematics, you have to apply different operators and transform things all the time. You have to transform one expression into another expression, right? You have to factor things. So, you have to make one thing equal or similar to another.
Yeah.
So this happens, but not only in mathematics, but in other domains in your life as well, where you gain enough experience and you can see that one thing will lead to the next, or this implies the other thing, and so forth. But these are processes that are happening under the hood. Does this make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah. So basically, the idea is that there are a lot of little agents doing a lot of different things in your mind, right? And when you go back and reread it, you'll see, these agents are building things, are combining things, are forming new skills based on old skills. You have examples of a skill, playing piano. You can move your hand over a note. You can locate a note. You can play a particular note. You press a key. You listen to it. You hear it. And then you can combine these things into a particular skill, playing middle C or playing a specific note. And then you combine those. So you have hierarchical hierarchical grouping. You have agents that are grouping things hierarchically in your mind. So there's a lot here that I can't get to today, but those are just the beginnings, right? Then we have to get into human development and what happens in human development. What happens in sensory motor development, what happens in egocentric development, theory of mind, where you start to understand other people and yourself. And we can talk about measures of mind, how you measure development. So I'm going to skim, so Piaget talked about the different things that people do at different ages. So when you're 0 years, 0 months old, you have some pure reflexes. You can suck, you can look, you can phonate, not necessarily speak, but make sounds with your mouth. You can hear, for healthy babies. Then they begin to search for objects within a particular modality. They start to form elementary habits, and they start imitation sporadically. Then later on, they grasp things. They repeat things deliberately. They start to recognize things, and so forth. So these are all the different things that happen to infants at different milestones in their development. And then there's a different model of intelligence where you have Cottrell, Horn, and Carroll. They came up with a different model of intelligence, and basically it summarizes all the pieces that go into human general intelligence using broad abilities: fluid reasoning, visual spatial ability, long-term storage, auditory processing, and so forth.
Question.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I see where you're saying like I guess Piaget looked at certain skills that are developed at certain ages. I mean, have you seen anything where there's like some comparative study with other, say, species, like say maybe apes, and see if there's maybe some sort of commonality with, intelligence in general, like with
Well,
other animals?
yeah, there's plenty of studies, primate studies, and studies
Mm-hmm.
with rats, on intelligence and speed of processing, how fast they can run through a maze, and so on, and whether or not they recognize letters or whether or not they recognize pictures and so forth. So there's plenty of psychological studies that exist for those
Yeah.
things.
One other question. How does I guess Piaget explain, for example, child prodigies? So like children who somehow seem to have an innate ability for a skill without having to say practice it as much as say other children.
He would
Does
he
he
would he
touch on
he
that in
would
any way?
he would probably just say that the development is a range, and this is where the average person is, but everybody's an individual, and so they may land differently on. Some people will pick up different abilities at earlier or later um, uh, points in their lives. So it's an individual thing. When they hit these milestones, will vary from individual to individual. Does that make sense? So naturally, some people will be faster, some individuals will be faster, and some individuals will be slower. These are just the averages of the ages. 1 year, 9 months to develop preconcepts, 2 years, 0 months to develop magical phenomenism, 2 year, 9 months to develop reasoning, 3 years, 6 months to develop animism,
So I
right?
mean, is there any reference to the whole thing about nature versus nurture? Like is
Yes. So
mm-hmm,
he says that Piaget takes the middle line. He says that it's not nature, it's not nurture, it's interaction. It's in the middle. It's the individual's interaction with the environment that drives development. He doesn't say that
mm,
it's nature. He doesn't say that it's nurture. He said it's the interaction of the individual with their environment that drives development. Does that make sense?
yeah. But I mean, so all right, so he's so is he saying that nurture doesn't play a part in that interaction? I mean, sorry, nature doesn't play a part in that, or how the, I
Well,
guess,
so
child
you
interacts with the
have
environment?
yeah, it's the interaction of the child with the environment. So, for
Mm-hmm.
example, there's two examples. One example is President President. There was a president, U.S. president. Why does his name escape me right now? The president before Ronald Reagan, U.S. president before Ronald Reagan. He was a peanut
It's the
farmer.
Adams or something like Jimmy.
No, Reagan, president in the 1970s. Uh,
Right before Reagan.
yes, right before Reagan, after Ford, and before Reagan.
I think it was
So
Jimmy
for
Adams. No, what's it?
Jimmy Carter, thank you very
Jimmy
much.
Carter. Yeah, Carter.
Yes, so Jimmy Carter was a peanut farmer. He came from he came from a very poor family, and he had a brother Billy and a sister, and all of them were poor, people. However, Jimmy had interactions with his teachers that helped him to develop. And later on, he went into the Navy. He became an admiral, and eventually he became president. Right? But if you leave it just as nature, right? It would be, all of them were from the same. He and his siblings were in the same socioeconomic uh, situation. So all of them should have, you know, eventually amounted to developed the same. If you leave it to nurture, well, all of them were nurtured the same, except for Jimmy, who had some interactions with some teachers that helped him to move forward in life a little bit, or much more ahead of than his siblings. So, you can look at that and say, it's not exactly nature, it's not exactly nurture. It's, maybe luck, but also, how that individual worked within its environment. So it's in the middle. It's not exactly nature, not exactly nurture. It's the interaction of the agent or the individual in their environment. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the next thing I talk about is minds, right? And you have different options for building artificial minds. So we're talking about AGIs now, right? And basically you have a mind and you have a device that the mind controls. Whether the mind is embodied or disembodied, it's generally operating on or operating with a device. And in this picture, the world is an oval. The device that's in the world is a circle, and then the mind is a square. So here you can have an individual mind with one body or one device that it controls. You can have an individual mind with many bodies or many devices. You can have several minds controlling one device. This would be in the case of like an airplane or something where you need failover systems, or if you need consensus among consensus for joint action. Maybe these three things reason differently, and you need 2 out of 3 to make a decision. You need agreement between at least 2 of these minds to make a decision for the body. Or you have like a hive mind where each individual mind controls a body, but all the minds communicate maybe to a master, something like that. Maybe like the Borg. So you have different kinds of configurations you can have of minds and bodies. Does this make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I've heard of the hive mind scenario.
Okay. And then I talk about building mind servers where you can download an app to your mobile phone or to a robot, and then have the cloud actually control your device. And from your phone, you may be able to turn on the lights in your house. So the cloud might be connected to some external device like the lights in your home or your thermostat or even your car to start your car. So anyway, this is like an architecture for a mind server. And then basically this is a template which, if you were to build one of these minds for a body in the world, what would that look like? How would you build a mind? What would you do to build a mind?
Oh, you're asking?
Yes, anybody.
Oh. What would I do to build a mind?
Yes.
So are you referring to what device would I use, or
Yeah, what device would you use for the body, and what components would you use for the mind?
Well, I mean, assuming that the brain is simply an information processing system, then I guess you could run whatever software on some sort of silicon-based chip.
Right, but
Um,
what is that? Whatever software, what is that?
well, I mean, it must work with sensors that takes in information from the environment, um, and yeah, I'm guessing. Well, my picture is some sort of coordinator or director that I guess chooses the proper actions based on the the percepts coming in, and you know yeah, I mean that's
Exactly.
my yeah.
Yeah, so that's what I would say too. So, putting together a template, you'd probably have the device situated in the world. You'd have some kind of component that receives the percepts from the device. You have some kind of um, component that determines what actions to take. You have some kind of component that um, actually executes the actions and maybe keeps track of them. You have some kind of probably planning component that generates, complex actions. And then you may have some uh, kind of component that takes in the percepts and figures out what this situation is similar to in order to help the decision making. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So these are different ways of laying out uh, a mind.
I
And
think
go ahead.
yeah, I think I touched on it last week. If is there some sort of social component to this? I mean, the ability to, I guess, infer the goals and of other agents in the system, or I mean,
Yeah.
the whole idea of essentially, inferring the thoughts of other agents, and I guess modifying your beliefs based on that and all of that stuff, or your
Sure.
actions and stuff.
Sure. You can build that in as a component.
Okay.
So these are some of the systems that have been built, and basically I just reoriented the system to fit this template, so that you can see, where the perceiving components are, where the reminding components are, where the planning components are, where the decisioning components are, and where the acting components are. So this is ACTR. This is made by John Anderson. You have a system called active inference. This is Carl Friston's um, system. This is one embodiment of his ideas. This is ERA by Eric Nivel and uh, Thoresen. Uh, this is another system basically, and it has different components. This is another system, case-based planner. This is the chef system. This system creates plans for cooking using case-based reasoning. Case-based reasoning is like a different strategy. Basically, you accumulate cases and you pick the relevant case and perhaps modify it if needed. This is Cognitive Architecture by Shanahan. And all of these pretty much do the same thing. They're controlling a device, right? But they do it in different ways. This way is more biologically, uh, it's more according to human biology than other ways. Joanna Bryson has a decision-making system called Complete Autonomous Agent. Um, Eric Mueller did the daydreamer system. So he explored mental simulation and daydreaming, and he had an algorithm that did different kinds of reminding and different kinds of uh, planning in a daydreaming manner. So this is his system. You've heard of IBM Watson?
Yeah.
This is IBM Watson.
Oh.
So basically, a person poses a question and it decomposes the question. It does a search. It generates candidate answers. It filters the answers. It gathers evidence, scores it, synthesizes the results, merges and ranks, and proposes the answer. This is basically the whole Watson, IBM Watson architecture. At least the architecture that won Jeopardy.
Mm-hmm.
John Holland had his architecture. So these are different architectures that people have built, different systems that people have built to do things. This one drives a car. Cooperative scheduling. Loading dock operations. My mistake. This one is a question answering system, but it's more than question answering. It actually stores information as well. You can tell it facts, and then it can figure out whether or not it's time to do something based on what you've told it, or it can answer questions. This one is based on several neural nets, I believe. Yeah. So each one of these boxes is a neural net. So, but anyway, these are, and this one plays a video game called Wargus. And it takes, it has the ability for someone to annotate its memory and give it instructions. Does this make sense? So anyway, basically, this is a motivation system developed by Dietrich Dorner and also implemented by Joscha Bach. And this is basically using different motivations. These are the motives, the different drives that a person may have, simulates a different drives. Anyway, so the basic idea is that from all these systems, we get certain requirements that might be useful, and then we can use those systems and replicate a system using patterns, design patterns that we've discovered, commonalities across all those different systems.
I have a question. I think it's
Go
probably
ahead.
my last question. Looking at that, I guess, diagram that you showed me where you had the mind, body, and then you had the control in the middle, planning. What would you say separates us, or the main thing that separates us as humans from, say, lesser animals? Like, what component that they don't have that we have that you'd say separates us? Is it the planning? Is it the reminding? Or is it?
Well, the only
Or is
problem
it
is,
that they have the? Mhm.
I
Or is
would
it
just,
that they have those components but just weaker version?
I wouldn't say that they're weaker or stronger. I would just say that we can't communicate with them, so we don't know exactly what they can do.
Oh, I see.
We don't have the ability to communicate directly with them. And so we really can't test the true extent of their abilities.
Mm. So you're saying that there is a possibility that they might be, say, more intelligent than us?
In certain respects, possibly yes. So, for example, you know, whales and dolphins have bigger brains than us. You know, so there may be a
Yeah.
lot going on that we don't know about,
Mm.
and it's configured differently than us. I guess we're almost out of time. Anyway,
Yeah.
I was just trying to give you an overview. You know, please, if you have other questions, let me know. We didn't really touch on any of the more serious things, but there's only so much you can do in a
Yeah.
short period of time. But I would encourage you to read the book. It's really deep. Um, and you know, thank you for giving me the opportunity to share some of it with you today.
All right. Thanks a lot. All right, guys. I think that's it. Yeah. Thanks again, Mike, for sharing.
Oh, my pleasure.
All right.
My pleasure.
All right. Bye, guys.
All right, take care.
Bye, bye.